The emergency sirens had been wailing across the Centauri Academy for 3 days straight ever since the Void Hunters' attack left the orbital station's outer ring in ruins. In the emergency shelter deep within the station's core, 200 alien students from dozens of species huddled in terror, their various forms of distress filling the air with clicks, hisses, and psychic static. The shelter resembled nothing so much as a subway station during a city-wide blackout, that same mixture of sterile functionality and barely contained panic that Marcus Webb remembered from his childhood in New York. But where? A human crowd might have been filled with nervous chatter and smartphone screens. Here the silence was broken only by the rhythmic scraping of Cytherian carapaces against metal walls and the soft, mournful humming of young Etherians whose translucent forms flickered like dying light bulbs. "The structural damage is irreversible," announced Headmaster Zorthik, his crystalline form flickering with anxiety patterns that reminded Marcus of a broken neon sign. "We must evacuate to the surface colonies immediately." But the students wouldn't move. Dr. Villana, the Altarian counselor, knelt beside a cluster of Vortech, juveniles normally the most aggressive species in the academy, now curled into defensive balls like giant, scaled hedgehogs. Her 6 arms moved in gentle, practiced gestures as she whispered in their native tongue, but they remained locked in their trauma response. Marcus stood at the back of the shelter, his human height making him visible above most of the crouched forms. At 19, he was older than most of the other students, a graduate exchange student studying Sen architecture. But right now, he felt like he was back in his elementary school classroom in Detroit, watching his classmates huddle under desks during tornado drills, their teacher's calm voice barely masking her own fear. The difference was that tornado drills ended. This terror had crystallized into something permanent. He watched as Headmaster Zorthik's attempts at authority crumbled. The ancient being's crystalline structure pulsed with increasingly erratic patterns, like a lighthouse whose beam had begun to stutter. "Please," Zorthik pleaded, his voice taking on harmonic undertones of desperation. "The Void Hunters may return. We cannot remain here." A young Pytherian named Silak raised her head, her compound eyes reflecting the emergency lighting in fractured rainbows. When she spoke, her voice carried the clicking undertones of her species' fear language. They came through the walls. "The void touched my shell sister. She became empty space." The shelter fell even quieter. Marcus recognized the particular quality of silence. It was the same silence that had filled his neighborhood after the factory explosion when he was 12, when everyone knew that some wounds were too large for words. But Marcus was looking at something else entirely. While the others saw cramped quarters and reinforced walls, he saw load-bearing beams positioned in a perfect spiral pattern. While they saw emergency lighting, he saw a network of power conduits that could be rerouted. While they saw a prison of necessity, he saw the skeleton of something impossible. "Give me 12 hours, he said simply, rolling up his sleeves. Dr. Villana's antennae twitched with confusion. "Marcus, this isn't the time for—" "It's exactly the time," he interrupted, already pulling out his multi-tool and scanning the shelters. "Support structure. Fear isn't just an emotion. It's an architectural problem. And every architectural problem has a creative solution." Marcus began his work at 0300 station time, when most of the students had finally succumbed to exhausted sleep. The shelter's emergency lighting cast long shadows that danced across huddled forms, creating a scene that reminded him of camping trips with his father, except instead of canvas tents, these were living beings wrapped in their own protective shells and energy fields. He started with the gravity generators. The attack had damaged the station's primary gravitational systems, leaving the emergency shelter operating on backup units that created overlapping fields of inconsistent strength. What the adults saw as a malfunction, Marcus saw as an opportunity. He carefully recalibrated the generators, creating zones where gravity flowed in spirals rather than straight lines, where up and down became suggestions rather than rules. Working by the light of his headlamp, he reminded himself of his father. Rebuilding their Detroit home after the flood, the same careful attention to load-bearing structures, a same intuitive understanding that repair wasn't about restoring what was broken, but about imagining what could grow from the pieces. As dawn cycle approached, Marcus had transformed the shelter's power distribution system. Emergency lighting that had once provided harsh, clinical illumination now pulsed gently through salvaged hull plating he'd arranged in organic patterns. The metal sheets, scarred and twisted from the Void Hunter attack, now formed something that resembled tree bark, if trees could be made of starlight. Kirith, a young Etherian whose form was barely visible in normal lighting, drifted closer as Marcus worked. Her species communicated through color shifts in their translucent bodies, and right now she was cycling through pale blues and greens, curiosity mixed with caution. "What are you building?" she whispered, her voice like wind through crystal. Chimes. Marcus paused in his rewiring of a gravity field generator. How could he explain that he wasn't building anything specific? That he was following an instinct older than blueprints, older than engineering specs? It was the same instinct that had led him to build cardboard rocket ships in his mother's apartment, to construct elaborate blanket forts that somehow felt bigger inside than outside. A place where scared doesn't have to mean small, he said. Finally. By 0600, other students were beginning to stir, drawn by the soft luminescence that now pulsed through what had been sterile metal walls. Marcus had woven together salvaged components into something that defied immediate classification, part architecture, part sculpture, part playground. The support beams he'd identified earlier now formed the trunk and main branches of an impossible tree, one that grew through multiple gravity fields and extended into spaces that shouldn't exist. Jackson, one of the Vortak juveniles, who had been catatonic with fear, uncurled slowly as he watched Marcus suspend a series of small hull fragments in a spiral pattern. The pieces moved in slow orbits around each other, creating the impression of falling leaves that never touched ground. "It's not finished," Marcus said, wiping metallic dust from his hands. "I need help with the branches." Dr. Velana approached, her 6 arms moving in patterns of professional concern. "Marcus, the evacuation ships will arrive in 4 hours. There's no time for—" "There's exactly time for this," he interrupted gently. "Look around. They're not hiding anymore." She followed his gaze and saw what he meant. Throughout the shelter, students were sitting up, their various forms of terror slowly giving way to curiosity. The Cytherian children had unlocked their carapaces. The young Etherians were solidifying, their forms becoming more visible as their fear translucency faded. But it was Silak who sealed Marcus's conviction. The young Cytherian who had spoken of her Shull sister's fate was now standing at the base of Marcus's creation, her compound eyes reflecting the gentle light patterns. When she reached out one delicate claw to touch a floating fragment, her voice carried none of yesterday's terror clicks. "It's like the memory trees of home," she whispered, "but made of ... hope." By midday, Marcus's architectural impossibility had become a living ecosystem. What had started as his solitary construction project had evolved into something collaborative, a dozen different species, contributing their unique abilities to create something none of them could have imagined alone. The Cytherian students, with their natural affinity for complex geometric patterns, had helped Marcus weave the gravity fields into intricate spirals. Their mathematical minds understood intuitively how to make space bend in ways that created pockets of weightlessness between the tree's branches. Watching them work reminded Marcus of his high school calculus teacher, Mrs. Chun, who had taught him that the most beautiful equations were often the ones that seemed impossible until you understood their underlying elegance. The Etherian children had contributed something even more precious, their ability to manipulate light itself. Where Marcus had created the tree's structure, they had given it life, weaving patterns of bioluminescence through the metal branches that pulsed like a gentle heartbeat. The shelter now glowed with the soft radiance of deep ocean creatures, transforming the sterile emergency space into something that felt alive. But it was the Vortog juveniles who surprised everyone most. Their species was known for aggression, for territorial dominance, for the kind of straightforward thinking that made them excellent military strategists, but poor artists. Yet when 12-year-old Grixon suggested that the tree needed singing branches, Marcus immediately understood. Asterisk, asterisk. Together, they had rigged sections of hull plating to vibrate at specific frequencies when the gravity currents passed through them. The result was a constant, subtle music harmonics that resonated at frequencies known to calm the nervous systems. Of most known species, the tree wasn't just a structure now. It was an instrument, playing the soundtrack to their healing. Dr. Velana stood at the shelter's entrance, her professional composure finally cracking as she watched her traumatized students climbing and laughing in the branches of something that shouldn't exist. A group of Altarian cubs had discovered that they could use their natural levitation abilities to dance between the floating hull fragments, creating patterns of movement that looked like living constellation charts. "This is impossible," she murmured to Headmaster Zorthik, who had arrived to assess the evacuation preparations. The ancient being's crystalline form pulsed with colors. Marcus had never seen before patterns that seemed to indicate profound bewilderment mixed with something approaching awe. "Impossible, yes," Zorthik agreed. "But observe the stress indicators." He gestured with one faceted appendage toward his students. Where 3 days ago they had exhibited every sign of severe trauma-locked carapaces, fear translucency, defensive. Posturing now, they moved with the fluid grace of creatures at play. Young beings who had been too terrified to venture beyond their sleeping areas were now swinging from impossible branches, their laughter filling the air with sounds of healing. "How?" Dr. Velana asked. 3 days of my best therapeutic interventions. Couldn't reach them. And this human builds them a tree, and suddenly they single quotes read ... Children again, Zorthik finished. Perhaps that is the answer itself. Marcus, overhearing from his position high in the tree's crown, where he was adjusting the final light patterns, called down. "We got so focused on their trauma, we forgot they were still kids. Kids don't need safety speeches. They need safe places to be kids." As if to prove his point, Silak came spiraling down one of the gravity-defying branches, her laughter creating harmonic patterns with the tree's ambient music. When she landed beside the adults, her compound eyes sparkled with something that had been absent for days' joy. "The evacuation shuttles have arrived," Zorthik announced, his voice carrying the formal tones of administrative duty. "All students must report to Bay 12 for immediate departure." The shelter fell quiet. In the branches above, dozens of young beings froze mid-play, their various forms of anxiety beginning to resurface. Marcus felt his heart sink as he recognized the return of familiar fear postures. But then Kirith, the young Etherian who had first approached him during construction, drifted down from the upper branches with something clutched in her translucent hands, a small fragment of hull plating that had been transformed into a perfect miniature version of their tree. "Can we take it with us?" she asked, her form glowing with hopeful blues and golds. The evacuation to the surface colony should have been routine, a simple matter of loading traumatized students onto transport ships and relocating them to temporary facilities planetside. Instead, it became something unprecedented in the Academy's 1,000-year history. 200 alien students refusing to board the shuttles unless they could bring their tree. You can't transport a gravitational anomaly through hyperspace. Captain Rischel explained with the patient tone of someone accustomed to explaining physics to academics. Her Centauran features carried the weathered look of a career space pilot, someone who understood that the universe had rules for good reasons. The field interactions would tear both ships apart. But Marcus was already sketching in his notebook, his mind racing through possibilities. The surface colony was a planned community, all geometric efficiency and optimal resource distribution. Exactly the kind of sterile functionality that these students had just learned to heal from. What they needed wasn't just transportation. They needed to understand that wonder could be portable. "We're not moving the tree," he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had just solved an impossible equation. "We're teaching them to build their own." The next 6 hours transformed the evacuation into something resembling a masterclass in applied imagination. Marcus divided the students into mixed species teams, each group responsible for understanding one aspect of their tree's impossible architecture. The Cytherian students mapped the mathematical relationships between gravity fields and structural stress. The Etherians documented the light patterns and their psychological effects. The Vortac juveniles, their natural aggression now channeled into protective instincts, became the project's fierce guardians, ensuring that every detail was preserved. Dr. Velana watched in amazement as her patients became teachers, each species sharing knowledge they hadn't even realized they possessed. Silak, who 3 days ago couldn't speak without terror clicks, was now explaining to a group of younger students how to calculate the resonance frequencies that made the branches sing. "This is unprecedented," Headmaster Zorthak observed, his crystalline form cycling through patterns of academic fascination. Interspecies collaboration at this level typically requires years of careful diplomatic preparation. Marcus looked up from where he was helping a team of Altarian cubs sketch the tree's light distribution network. Maybe that's because we usually start with the assumption that cooperation is hard. These kids are starting with the assumption that building something beautiful together is fun. The parallel to his own childhood struck him forcefully summer afternoons in Detroit when the neighborhood kids would gather in the vacant lot behind Mrs. Rodriguez's house, building elaborate structures from whatever they could scavenge. It didn't matter that they spoke different languages at home, or that their parents sometimes viewed each other with suspicion. When you were 8 years old and trying to build a fort that could withstand imaginary alien invasions, differences became resources rather than obstacles. As the evacuation shuttles waited, something remarkable happened. The students' documentation project had evolved into something more. They were creating a complete methodology for healing architecture. Not just blueprints, but a philosophy of space that prioritized wonder over efficiency, play over productivity. Captain Rischel found herself drawn into the project despite her initial skepticism. Her pilot's understanding of three-dimensional navigation became crucial for mapping the tree's impossible geography. "I've been flying for 40 years, she admitted to Marcus, "and I've never seen spatial relationships quite like this." "How? Did you know it would work?" Marcus paused in his sketching, thinking of his father's hands teaching him to see load-bearing potential in a pile of scrap wood, of his mother's voice explaining that home wasn't about having the right furniture, but about creating the right feeling. "I didn't know it would work," he said finally, "but I knew they needed it to work. Sometimes that's enough." The final transport was delayed by 3 hours, but nobody complained. By the time the students finally boarded, each carried not just personal belongings, but carefully preserved fragments of their tree, pieces of whole plating, carved with light-conducting channels, small gravity generators programmed with impossible field equations, recordings of the harmonic frequencies that had helped them sleep without nightmares. But more importantly, they carried the knowledge that trauma wasn't permanent, that fear could be transformed into joy through the simple act of building something beautiful together. As the shuttles departed, Dr. Velana settled beside Marcus in the observation deck, watching the Academy's damaged structure recede into star-filled darkness. "You've revolutionized therapeutic architecture," she said. "Do you understand what you've accomplished?" Marcus smiled, thinking of all the children throughout the galaxy who might benefit from understanding that healing could happen through play, that safety could be built from wonder rather than walls. "I think," he said quietly, "we've just figured out how to build hope out of salvage." 6 months later, the Centauri Colony's Integration Center looked nothing like the sterile temporary facility it had been designed to be. What had started as a standard residential complex for displaced Academy students had evolved into something unprecedented, a living laboratory where interspecies healing architecture was being refined and shared across the galaxy. Marcus stood in what they now called the Central Grove, watching as a new group of refugee children from the Outer Rim conflicts took their first tentative steps into a tree that defied every conventional understanding of physics and psychology. These weren't Academy students. They were war orphans from a dozen different species, traumatized by conflicts that had raged for generations. Yet within hours of arrival, they were climbing impossible branches and adding their own cultural touches to the living structure. A group of young saurians had contributed crystalline formations that stored and refracted light in patterns that reminded them of their destroyed homeworld. Refugee Aquitilian children had somehow incorporated flowing water elements that shouldn't exist in low gravity, creating streams that flowed upward through hollow branches. "The applications are limitless," Dr. Velana reported during their weekly holoconference with the Galactic Council's Emergency Response Committee. Her academic excitement was tempered by genuine awe as she gestured toward the thriving community around them. "We've documented therapeutic breakthroughs across 47 species. Children who were completely non-responsive to traditional treatments are now actively participating in their own healing through collaborative construction." But Marcus was watching something even more significant. Silak, now 7 months past her trauma, was teaching a group of newly arrived children how to weave gravity fields into supportive patterns. Her compound eyes sparkled with the confidence of someone who had discovered that her greatest pain could become her greatest gift to others. "The most profound discovery," he said to the assembled council members, "isn't the architecture itself. It's that healing happens fastest when it becomes a collaborative act of creation rather than individual treatment." The response had been extraordinary. Requests for hope trees, as the children had named them, were coming from across the galaxy. Refugee camps, hospital stations, even some military outposts were asking for consultation on how to transform sterile, fearful spaces into environments where traumatized beings could rediscover joy. But the real test came when the Void Hunters returned. The attack on New Geneva Station should have been devastating. The same species that had traumatized the Academy students, using the same reality-tearing weapons. But this time, the station was prepared not with additional shielding or weapon systems, but with something unprecedented, a community that had learned to build wonder faster than terror could destroy it. Within hours of the attack's end, before the emergency responders had even arrived, the station's children, human, Altarian, Cytherian, and dozens of other species, were already salvaging wreckage and beginning to build. Not just shelters, but impossible structures that defied grief itself. Marcus watched the footage from his position in the colony's communication center, his throat tight with emotion. On the screen, a young human girl was teaching a group of Vortic children how to weave whole fragments into patterns that caught and held starlight. Nearby, a group of Etherian adolescents was collaborating with Centaurian engineers to create gravity fields that allowed beings to dance between floating debris. "They're not just rebuilding," Captain Rishal observed, her pilot's practical eye recognizing something extraordinary. "They're transforming the attack itself into raw materials for joy." Dr. Velana nodded, her 6 arms moving in patterns of professional amazement. The psychological profiles are unprecedented. Instead of trauma responses, we're seeing what can only be described as creative resilience. They've learned to metabolize fear into wonder. But it was Headmaster Zorthek who understood the deeper implications. His ancient crystalline form pulsed with colors that indicated profound contemplation as he watched young beings from across the galaxy collaborating on impossible architectures of healing. "This is not merely therapeutic," he said slowly. "This is evolutionary. We are witnessing the emergence of a new form of interspecies consciousness, one that builds unity from diversity, hope from trauma, wonder from wreckage." Marcus smiled, thinking of his father's hands teaching him to see potential in broken things, of his mother's voice explaining that home was something you built rather than something you found. On the screen, children from a dozen worlds were laughing as they constructed something that had never existed before, a playground made from the remnants of an attack, a garden grown from the seeds of shared healing. The architecture of imagination had become something larger than any single structure. It had become a way of being in the universe, one that recognized that the most powerful response to destruction wasn't stronger walls, but more beautiful ways of building bridges between differences. As the communication ended and the stars wheeled overhead, Marcus made his way to the central grove, where the night shift of children was adding their own dreams to the ever-growing tree. Tomorrow, there would be new refugees, new traumas, new seemingly impossible problems to solve. But tonight, there was the sound of interspecies laughter rising through impossible branches, toward stars that suddenly seemed much closer than before, and the quiet certainty that somewhere in the galaxy, children were learning that wonder was always stronger than fear, as long as you knew how to build it together. Asterisk.